So let's talk about the Egoic Ouroboros. So the Ouroboros is basically an artistic representation of the self-consuming nature of nature. Because all the consider the prey and the predator. Both the prey and the predator are forms of nature. What is life for the predator is death for the prey. So all living beings that you see around depend on other living beings for their sustenance. And all these living beings are expressions of nature. So nature basically consumes itself to perpetuate itself, and balance is maintained. So it's a circular phenomenon in which, so the Ouroboros is basically a snake that eats its own tail. It's a representation of the cycle of birth and death, which is continuously happening. So now, as one progresses along the spiritual search, one realizes that one's own ego is also a self-consuming phenomenon. There's the initial stage of life in which we live in order to serve the ego, essentially, to be more than what we are at this moment, to grow. And that is driven entirely by the ego, the desire to grow. But once this desire to grow reaches excessive proportions, one reaches a phase where one attempts to curb the insatiable nature of the egoic desire towards infinity. And one tries to become less than what one is right now in an attempt to maintain balance due to the excessive growth that the ego puts one through. And one then tries to kill the ego. But the only thing that happens is the perpetuation of the ego due to that, because it's the ego that says, I killed the ego. It's just the ego returning through the back door, claiming to have killed itself, but only managing to have perpetuated itself. So this phenomenon goes on for a while, in which one attempts to kill the ego, but inevitably fails to, and realizes that one has only perpetuated one's ego in throughout the attempt to kill the ego. Because it's the suffering produced by the ego's desire towards infinity that causes one to question these matters and consider and contemplate them in depth. And that suffering causes one to try and find the end of that suffering, which causes one to try to kill the ego, which also fails. Until, in a moment of realization, it is seen that the ego is non existent. It's just an object, a self consuming object, self consuming, self perpetuating object, because all attempts of the ego to consume itself only lead to its perpetuation. Self consuming, self perpetuating object, due to which it's a circle. So that's just another object. Just as every piece of creation is an object that is a form taken on by consciousness, the ego is also a form taken on by consciousness, which is the absolute truth. And that absolute truth is the sole reality, and there is no universe, because the universe is that absolute truth taking the form of the universe and appearing to itself as the universe. So when this is realized, the auroboric nature of the ego is seen. Its self-consuming, self-perpetuating nature is seen, and its non-existence is also seen, due to which liberation from the ego is attained. Because when one is in the phase of trying to kill the ego, one enters a mode of sadomasochism, emotional sadomasochism, in which one derives a perverse kind of pleasure from hurting oneself or talking in brutal ways to oneself. So that whole phenomenon dissolves in an instant when it is seen that one is the absolute truth of pure consciousness here and now. that dissolves the Ouroboric ego.